In the early 2000s, survival horror was starting to change. Games were giving players more weapons, more control, and more ways to fight back. Fear was still part of the experience, but it was slowly sharing space with action. Then, Fatal Frame came along and moved in the opposite direction. Instead of handing you a shotgun, it gave you a camera and told you to look directly at the things you were most afraid of. At the time, that felt completely different. And that difference is exactly why the game was so effective at scaring people. Back then, horror games were gradually making players feel more capable. Combat systems were becoming smoother, enemies were becoming more predictable. Even when resources were limited, you often felt like you had a plan. You could aim, shoot, and survive through sheer skill. Fatal Frame stripped most of that comfort away. You're not fast, you're not strong, and you're not well equipped for a fight. From the moment you step into the mansion, you feel like you do not belong there, and the game never lets you forget that. The biggest reason for that is your main weapon. You do not carry a gun, you carry the Camera Obscura. On paper, that sounds safer. You're not getting close with a knife or struggling to line up headshots with clumsy controls, but in practice, the camera makes every encounter more intimate and more terrifying. To damage a ghost, you have to look directly at it through the lens, and the most powerful shots come when you wait until the ghost is right in front of you. That changes the entire emotional rhythm of combat. Most horror games teach you to create distance from the threat. You run, you reposition, you keep space between you and the monster. In Fatal Frame, distance makes you weaker. You are rewarded for letting the ghost come closer, for holding your ground, and for staring at it as it drifts towards your face. Every fight becomes a test of nerves, not reflexes. You're not just pulling a trigger, you're making a decision to stand still while something unnatural moves closer and closer, filling the screen, distorting the air around you. The fear comes from proximity and from the fact that you have to willingly endure it to survive. That design choice alone made the game feel like a breath of fresh air. While other titles were leaning toward action and empowerment, Fatal Frame built its horror around forced confrontation and vulnerability. The atmosphere pushes this even further. There's very little music guiding your emotions. Long stretches of the game are wrapped in silence, broken only by footsteps, distant creaks, or a faint sound that might mean something is nearby. Movement is slow, hallways are tight, rooms feel heavy and closed in. You're not rushing from set piece to set piece. You're creeping through a place that feels abandoned and yet constantly watched. In more action-focused horror games, tension often spikes during fights and then releases once the enemy is gone. In Fatal Frame, the tension rarely drops. Even empty rooms feel dangerous because you never know when a ghost might fade into view right in front of you. The enemies themselves add to that unease. These are not creatures that charge at you like animals or soldiers. They move in ways that feel wrong. They float, twitch, and drift through space like they're not bound by the same rules you are. Some barely react to your presence at all, which makes the encounters feel less like battles and more like intrusions from another world. You're not clearing areas, you're surviving interruptions from things that should not exist. All of this ties back to one core idea. Fatal Frame keeps you vulnerable at all times. Your movement is limited, your visibility is poor, your only defense requires you to face the threat head on. The game never lets you fully feel in control, and that lack of control is where the fear lives. While other survival horror games were experimenting with bigger fights and more capable protagonists, Fatal Frame focused on something simpler and, in many ways, scarier. It made you slow down, it made you look, and it made sure that every time you did, something might be looking back. That commitment to vulnerability, atmosphere, and psychological fear is what made Fatal Frame feel so different at the time. And it is why, even today, it still stands as one of the most unsettling horror experiences ever made. But part of what makes the game so memorable is not just how it plays. It is the world it drops you into and the story quietly unfolding around you. The game is set in the Himuro mansion, an isolated traditional Japanese estate that feels less like a house and more like a sealed tomb. From the very beginning, you're not here by choice. You arrive searching for someone who has already gone missing, and almost immediately it becomes clear that the mansion has a long and violent history.
何かに呼ばれるような、そんな不思議な感覚を覚えながら。兄さん。
Instead of delivering its story through long cutscenes, Fatal Frame leans heavily on notes, diaries, and environmental clues. As you explore, you slowly piece together the truth behind the failed ritual that once took place here. The mansion was the site of a ceremony meant to seal away a terrible supernatural force. The ritual required a human sacrifice, known as the Rope Shrine Maiden, whose death was believed to keep a gate to the underworld closed. When the ritual failed, that gate opened and the mansion became permanently tainted by the suffering that occurred inside it. That tragedy is not just backstory. It is the reason the halls are filled with ghosts, many of whom are not simply hostile enemies, but lingering victims of the ritual and its aftermath. Their presence gives the horror a layer of sadness and history, making encounters feel tragic as well as terrifying. This blend of personal tragedy and supernatural horror is a defining trait of the series. Fatal Frame is not about random monsters. It is about places where human suffering has left a permanent spiritual wound. At the center of your survival is the Camera Obscura, an antique camera with the power to capture and damage spirits. In gameplay terms, it is your weapon. In the story, it is something far more mysterious. The camera is not just a tool someone picked up on the way into the mansion. It is a history tied to spiritual research and the study of the supernatural. It was designed specifically to interact with ghosts, turning the act of photographing them into a form of exorcism. This idea does two important things. First, it grounds the combat in the world's lore, making it feel like a ritual rather than a conventional fight. Second, it reinforces the theme that seeing is dangerous. The more clearly you see the spirit world, the more exposed you become to it. Throughout the game, you upgrade the camera with different lenses and abilities, each one deepening your connection to the supernatural. Mechanically, this gives you new ways to fight. Thematically, it feels like you are tuning a device that was never meant for ordinary people to use. By the end of the game, you're not just someone with a weapon. You're someone who has stared into a hidden world over and over again, and that repeated exposure is part of what makes this journey so unsettling. All of this laid the foundation for the identity of the Fatal Frame series. While many horror franchises chased scale, explosions, and bigger enemies, Fatal Frame stayed focused on intimate spaces, personal tragedies, and the thin boundary between the living and the dead. Each entry explores a different haunted location with its own history, but the emotional core remains the same. A place marked by ritual, loss, and unresolved spirits. A protagonist drawn into that place, and a camera that turns fear into the only means of survival. This is where the connection to Fatal Frame to Crimson Butterfly becomes interesting. The second game does not continue the exact same story or return to the same mansion, but it carries forward the same themes and spiritual logic. Instead of Himuro Mansion, you explore a lost village frozen in time by another failed ritual. Once again, the horror is rooted in tradition, sacrifice, and the idea that human attempts to control the spirit world can go horribly wrong. The Camera Obscura returns as well, reinforcing the sense that these events are part of a larger world where certain objects, people, and places are spiritually sensitive. You're not dealing with isolated hauntings, you're stepping into a hidden layer of reality that the series slowly reveals piece by piece. Understanding the first Fatal Frame gives you a deeper appreciation for the tone and intentions of the second. You start to recognize the series' patterns, the quiet exploration, the tragic backstories, the way combat forces you to confront fear instead of overpower it. It also helps explain why these games feel so different from other survival horror titles, even decades later. They're not built around spectacle, they're built around atmosphere, folklore, and emotional weight. As we get closer to the remake of Fatal Frame 2, going back to where the series began makes it clear what makes these games special. They're not just about being scared in the moment, they're about being pulled into places where the past refuses to stay buried, where every corridor holds a memory, and where survival means facing what most people would rather never see. Fatal Frame showed that horror could be quiet, personal, and deeply rooted in cultural myth. It proved that a game could terrify players without giving them power, speed, or overwhelming firepower. All it needed was a dark hallway, a restless spirit, and a camera that forced you to keep your eyes open. And that design philosophy is exactly what the series continues to build on, all the way into its most beloved entries. So, before stepping into the tragedy of the next haunted village, it is worth remembering the mansion that started it all. Because once you understand why Fatal Frame worked, you start to see the entire series not just as horror games, but as interactive ghost stories, the kind that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. And with Fatal Frame 2 getting a remake pretty soon, this feels like the perfect time to go back to where it all began. The first game sets the tone for everything the series would become. The focus on tragic rituals, haunted locations shaped by human suffering, and the camera that forces you to face the dead instead of running from them. These ideas did not end at Himuro Mansion. They evolved, deepened, and became even more emotionally powerful in the second game. So, if you're planning to step into the remake of Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly, understanding the foundation laid here makes that experience even richer. You start to recognize the patterns, the themes, and the design philosophy that define the series. And that's why, in the next video, we're going to break that down in a much more practical way. The key story elements, the important themes, and the mechanics you should understand before returning to one of the most beloved entries in survival horror. Think of this as the ghost story that started it all, and the next one as your guide to surviving what comes next. Thank you all for watching. My name is Herc, and this is Horror Visuals. If you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and leave the notifications on so you know when the next video comes out. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you on the next one.